Let's look at the scripture Matthew 26, verse 26. Esthionton deoton, labon ho Jesus arton, kai eulogesas eklasen, kai dus tois mathatais apen. By the way, a Greek-speaking person would be rolling on the floor laughing right now if he or she could hear the way I'm pronouncing the Greek. But you remember we're using a classroom or a classical pronunciation rather than the way a Greek-speaking person would speak this language. Okay, as we scan these words, we want to find a finite verb in an independent clause. And as we look at the words here, I come to this word eklasen. All right, here is my finite verb. If I continue on to my major punctuation mark, the comma, I see one other, this word apen. So I have two finite verbs here. Let's look at the first one here. This verb comes from the lexical entry klao. Klao means I break. There's your augment out front. So this is an indicative verb. You look at the ending. The epsilon nu ending is an active third-person singular ending. And you see the sigma tense indicator. This is an aorist. Aorist, active, indicative, third singular. So he or she or it broke something. Let's analyze our other verb, apen. Here is an irregular verb. Remember that the stem ape is the aorist stem of the verb lego. Apen would be parsed aorist, active, indicative, third singular. He or she or it said something. So he or she or it broke, and he, she, or it said. Now let's see if the subject of these verbs is further expressed. What we want to try to find now would be a singular nominative noun to be the subject. And here we are, ho Jesus, Jesus. Masculine singular nominative. Jesus broke, and Jesus said. All right, let's look at our other words here. And as we scan them, we see this accusative, arton, masculine, singular accusative, bread. Jesus broke bread. Now you can actually say the bread, even though the definite article is not there. Jesus broke the bread and said. Now let's see what happens to the other words surrounding these words in our scripture. If we look at this word right before the word Jesus, labon, let's analyze this word. We've actually seen it before when we were looking at the formation of participles. Here's our irregular verb lambano. And we remember that the aorist stem of lambano is the stem lab. And if we want an active participle, there's our active participle indicator with our connecting vowel omicron. Remember, this is a second aorist, so the second aorist does not have a sigma tense indicator and is going to use the same endings as the present tense in a participial construction. If I want a masculine singular nominative, because this participle will be referring to the action of Jesus, masculine singular nominative, I'm not going to put any ending here. In the third declension, your singular nominative ending is either sigma or nothing. So what happens here is the tau falls away because it can't stand at the end of a word, and the omicron lengthens to an omega, and we have the form then resulting labon. Now this is an aorist participle. Notice that in our text there is no definite article in front of the participle. It is an adverbial aorist participle. So what happens before Jesus breaks the bread? Well, first, he's got to take it. So Jesus takes the bread, then he breaks it. In other words, the aorist adverbial participle shows us action antecedent to or before the action of the verb which it is modifying. Now, this is not necessarily the best interpretation of this adverbial participle. It's obvious, isn't it, that Jesus has to take the bread if he's going to break it. When we see a participle where the action of the participle is so closely allied to the action of the verb which it is modifying, in other words, it is obvious that Jesus has to take the bread before he breaks it, this particular function of the participle is called attendant circumstance. It is an attending action to the action of your verb. So here's a very good example of an attendant circumstance adverbial participle. And in your grammar, you'll find attendant circumstance participles on page 562 and following, and you'll see the various examples given to you on those pages. Let's go back to our text. This is a very frequently occurring function of adverbial participles, attendant circumstance. The author could have used an indicative verb here. Jesus took the bread and broke it. But stylistically, the author chose to use a participle. So now you'll translate an attendant circumstance participle with the same mood translation as you do your finite verb. The mood of this finite verb is indicative. He broke. Jesus broke. So I'm going to translate this attendant circumstance participle with that same mood idea. He took. Jesus took the bread and broke it. Let's now look at the word in front of eklesin, this word eulogesos. And I'll write that a little larger on my pad. Eulogesos. This word comes from the lexical entry eulogeo. You see the English eulogy here? Eulogeo means I speak well of, but it can also mean I bless or I give thanks. Now let's analyze this verb form. If I wanted to create an aorist participle out of eulogeo, let's see how that would happen. My stem is euloge, and if I want an aorist active participle, this is a first aorist, so I've got my sigma tense indicator, alpha connecting vowel, active participle indicator. And since this participle is referring to Jesus doing the action, it will be masculine singular nominative. Now the first aorist active participle will put a sigma ending for the masculine singular nominative. Now we've learned before what happens when dentals are followed by sigma. They elide, they fall away. And so the resulting form would be eulogesos. This is an aorist active participle, masculine, singular, nominative. Let's look back at our text, and we notice that there is no definite article in front of this participle. This is an adverbial participle. It's an aorist adverbial participle. So tell me something about the time of the action in this participle in relation to the time of the action of this verb which it is modifying. That's right, it is happening before or antecedent to Jesus breaking the bread. What did he do before he broke it? He blessed it. We could use a translation after or when. After he blessed it, he broke it. You could also see this participle as an attendant circumstance participle, just like this participle labon. The action is not quite so obvious as labon. Jesus has to take the bread if he's going to break it. But another characteristic of attendant circumstance participles is that they can help to move the action along, and you'll see a sequence of action going on here. I still prefer to interpret this particular participle as antecedent action, emphasizing that Jesus blesses the bread before he breaks it. So Jesus took the bread, and after blessing it, he broke it. And now let's take a look at this next word, deuce. You remember our verb didomi? How could you forget, huh? And that the basic stem, excuse me, the basic stem of didomi is do, or the short form, do. That's the basic stem of this me verb. To form the aorist active participle of this me verb, I would take my stem, do. I'm not going to add a connecting vowel. Remember that in many forms of me verbs, there is no connecting vowel. I'm simply going to attach the active participle indicator. Now remember, this is an aorist form. If it were present, I would have to see my entire present tense stem, do. This is just the basic stem. This is the aorist form. Active participle indicator. And this me verb is going to attach a masculine singular nominative ending of sigma. What happens when these dental consonants are followed by sigma? That's right, they elide. And now let's learn something that's going to occur. You notice this Omicron vowel has lost these consonants following it here, and it has to compensate for the loss of these consonants. So what happens here is that this Omicron will go through what we call compensatory lengthening. It's not regular lengthening. It is a lengthening for compensation, that something has been lost and needs to be compensated for. And an Omicron does not lengthen to an omega in this case, but rather it lengthens to the diphthong Omicron upsilon. And then I still have my sigma on the end. Let's talk a moment about vowels that go through compensatory lengthening. You'll find this in section 1 of the grammar, but rather than referring to the grammar right now, let's simply look at it on the pad here. There are 3 vowels which can go through compensatory lengthening. And alpha, when it goes through compensatory lengthening, simply becomes a long alpha, and you really don't notice any difference. And epsilon, when it goes through compensatory lengthening, becomes the diphthong epsilon iota. And an omicron, when it goes through compensatory lengthening, becomes the diphthong omicron upsilon. You see how this is different from regular lengthening? In regular lengthening, an alpha would become an eta, an epsilon would also become an eta, and an omicron through regular lengthening would become an omega. So, this word deuce is an aorist active participle, masculine, singular, nominative. And now let's look at it in our text. We notice there is no definite article in front of it. This is an adverbial participle. It is an aorist adverbial participle. And so it's telling us that the action contained in this participle happens before or antecedent to the action of the verb which it is modifying. Before Jesus says something, he's going to give the bread. He's going to give it tois mathetais. Mathetais, masculine. Even though it looks feminine there, it's a masculine noun. It's masculine first declension. Masculine plural dative. And this dative would be indirect object. These are the people to whom or for whom something is done or given. So Jesus is going to give the bread to his disciples, and then he's going to say something. Jesus takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, he gives it to the disciples, and then he says something. You can see how the narrative moves and how these participles help to move the narrative. So this participle dus could also be considered attendant circumstance, that it is helping to move the narrative. You could also see it as antecedent time. That's not incorrect, because it is definitely happening here that he gives the bread to the disciples before he says something. But it's better really to see these as attendant circumstance participles. They're simply helping to move the narrative along. Let's now go to the beginning of the verse, es theonton de auton. Now we see this little word de. We know that is a post-positive conjunction, so it does not occur as the first word. Let's just pretend it's not there for just a moment. And look at this form, es theonton auton. Es theonton is a participle. You see your active participle indicator? And it comes from the verb estheo. Estheo means I eat. It's using the present tense stem. This is a present active participle. And the omega nu ending is a plural genitive. Present active participle, masculine plural genitive. The word auton is masculine plural genitive, and it is the subject of this participle. Notice that the subject here, auton, is different from the main subject of the verse, Jesus. So this participle is an adverbial participle called genitive absolute. That is, it is an adverbial participle in the genitive case. The subject of it is also in the genitive case. And this subject is not the same subject as the main subject of the verse. So Greek is throwing this construction into the genitive case to put it someplace. Now, not only do we recognize that it is a genitive absolute, but we must also recognize some other syntactical function. This is a present tense adverbial participle. So the action going on in this participle is happening contemporaneously. It's happening at the same time as the action of the verb which it is modifying, which is this verb ekklasin. So you see, while Jesus takes the bread and blesses it, while this is happening, the people are eating, the disciples are eating. We could translate this participle while or when or as or during. While they were eating, Jesus took the bread and, after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, notice I stick the little word and in here, even though it's not here. When you're dealing with attendant circumstance participles, it is quite frequent that you would put the conjunction and inserted, even though it's not there. Jesus took the bread and broke it. Now the word and is here in front of this participle, and I'm interpreting this participle not attendant circumstance, but as antecedent time. Let's go over this again. We start off with our genitive absolute. While they were eating, Jesus took the bread, and after he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to the disciples and said. Now let's see what Jesus says. Labete, fagete, tuto estin to soma mu. Now this will bring us to our next topic of discussion, which will be imperatives.